afternoon, everyone. I'm Rachel Harkness. I'm the programming manager of the Portland Public Library. And we're so happy today to be hosting Megan Grumbling in conversation with Gibson Fay LeBlanc today at our literary lunch series. They'll be discussing Megan's new collection of poems, Persephone in the Late Anthropocene. I also want to let you know about our upcoming literary lunch on February 17th. Susan Conley will be discussing her new book, Landslide, with Jed Coffin. And I'd like to thank our sponsors, Longfellow Books, who are selling copies of the book. I'll just introduce the authors and then we'll get started. Megan Grumbling's poetry collection, Booker's Point, received the Vassar Miller Prize and the Maine Literary Award for Poetry. And her work has been awarded the Poetry Foundation's Ruth Lilly Fellowship, the Robert Frost Foundation Award, and the Hawthornden Castle Fellowship in Scotland. She teaches at Southern Maine Community College and the University of New England and lives and writes in Portland. And Gibson Fay LeBlanc is a writer, teacher, and the executive director of the Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance. His first book of poems, Death of a Ventriloquist, won the Vassar Miller Prize and was published in 2012. Gibson served as Portland's 5th poet laureate, ending his 3-year term in 2018. His projects include written, spoken, rapped, and a multimedia website aimed at the high school teachers and students interested in writing poetry, and Deep Water, a column that features a poem each Sunday in the Maine Sunday Telegram, and now continues with poet Megan Grumbling as editor. So thanks for being here and enjoy.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rachel, for having us. This is such a pleasure to have a chance to talk with Megan about her book. And we were just saying before we started that the launch of the book online, which was, I don't know, a while back. What is time anymore? But it was a lovely event, and it was a multimedia reading and video and music. And it was awesome to be there and be a part of it. But this is a chance to talk one-on-one, which is a different and beautiful thing in a different way. So, Megan, did you want to start with those? Should I start with a question, or do you want to read a poem or two to get us going? What do you think?
I can start with a poem. You want me to?
Yeah, that'd be great.
All right. I'm going to start with a poem that is early on in the book and starts to kind of set things up. So there are a couple different voices in the book. There's Persephone, of course, her mother Demeter, and then kind of a Greek chorus, which is just sort of like us hanging out and watching all this stuff go down. And so this is the chorus, and the poem is called Short Shorts. At first, it was all beer gardens and orange dreamsicles. She wasn't supposed to be around now. These were her months to be away with him, eating stones and stroking clocks, or whatever she did with him. But she had chosen us. And at first, it was all holiday, all innocent debauchery, whenever she appeared out of season. Here she was, in a canary yellow halter dress, opening flows of hoppy ale. Here she was in short shorts, drenching us in dandelion fizz, or with huge buttercups, grazing our chins with yolk gold. We made merry, made noise, made hay, made out like magpies. Then she was gone again. She left us each time with our suddenly bared skin, our yellowed chins, and our chosenness, with our school child sensation of having gotten away with something slight but delicious.
Thank you. Yeah, it's good. Better to start with the poem. We gotta thicken the air with some poetry here. Great sounds in that. But I did want to start at the beginning, and I wanted to ask you how you started to conceive of this project, and, what some of the first poems were, how they, and just like, how did that start to happen for you as you?
Sure.
Yeah.
I actually had the premise in my head for probably like a decade, honestly. I've always been really interested in the Persephone myth. My mom used to read me a beautiful children's book illustrated with these gorgeous ink and watercolor paintings of the myth. And So, and I'm very like oriented to the outdoors and the seasons, especially being in Maine. And so as the effects of climate change and climate crisis and the more erratic seasons we've been experiencing have become more tangible, I started thinking about, wow, well, what happens to some of these sort of archetypes and stories? And I know that not all seasons are the same everywhere. And so there's a particular, but for me, how does the story change? And so I kind of made some notes on it for years. Like I said, I thought maybe it would be a short film or maybe it would be an essay. And I just would like doodle some notes and nothing ever stuck or seemed like it would work. And then I was at Hune Oaks, the artist colony in Lovell, which is the most beautiful residency I've ever been to. And they just started coming out like that prose poem that I just read. It's not lineated. It's just like, looks like a paragraph on the page. And I don't usually write like that as a poet. So it's totally weird but fun. It was so fun, these prose poems being the first voices of the book. And it evolved from there. Persephone looks like a poem in the page rather than like a prose poem. She's less pedestrian than the chorus. So it sort of evolved from there, but the prose poems were the first. So good thing I listened to them, because otherwise, who knows?
Absolutely. And at what point did you hook up with Dennis and like the whole idea of the contemporary opera, building that kind of, did that happen fairly early on as you were starting to write these things? Yeah.
Yep, it did. Dennis and I had worked on some other projects previously, and there had just been an open call for the Belfast Poetry Festival, which does, I don't know if it still does, but has in the past done a lot of really collaborative works with poets and other artists. So I had written like maybe 4 of the poems at that point, and I asked Dennis if he wanted to do something for the Belfast Poetry Festival. And he was like, sure. And so he wrote, scored them, and we got some actors and a director and went up and did that. And we kind of tacitly, or I guess maybe it wasn't tacit, but we agreed that we would continue. I had a whole project in mind, and we just kept going with it. So I really wrote it apace the development of the opera, which is an interesting way to work as a poet,
Yeah. And you mentioned already a little bit, and I don't want to undersell it, because there are a lot of kinds of poems in this book, right? So there's these chorus poems, which are prose poems. There's Demeter's poems. There's Persephone's poems. There are the aphorisms from the New Farmer's Almanac. There's these crypto academic study texts that you created that are wonderful. And I'm curious about like, how long did it take you to figure out, they all have different forms, they have different containers. And I'm wondering how long it took you to sort of figure out, okay, these poems are going to look like this, these are going to look and sound like that,
Well, it's interesting in terms of what they look like, because I wasn't thinking about that so hard while the opera was going on, because it would be obvious what the voices were when there are different people delivering them. And it wasn't until I was really putting the manuscript together well after the opera was done to see what it was going to be like on the page, that Persephone's on this side of the page and Demeter's kind of in the middle and But I guess I was thinking more as a storyteller as I was writing the poems themselves during the opera and its development. So like the we's are very prosaic, obviously, and they're kind of like little, like kind of schlubby like us and don't know what they're doing so much. So they're very prosy. And then Persephone is much more lyric and epic. And so she has a different sound and she has different lengths of lines that reflect that. And Demeter is sort of the storyteller of the whole book in a way. And so she has a particular tone and so it kind of developed based on the narrative needs of the opera, I guess.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I was going to say Demeter is like one of the main through lines that kind of helps us, she provides like some forward momentum about sort of the mystery and what happened. And yeah.
Right. And she talks directly to us in a way that none of the other voices do exactly with that level of directness.
I was also thinking as I was rereading the book about how, so we get the first part of the book, the first half really, where we get these distinct voices talking to us, and we start to put these pieces together about what's happening. And then right around the middle of the book, though the voices are still discernible from each other, they start to blend together. And I was thinking in particular in that there's a poem called Too Many Mirrors right in the middle, where they literally all the voices are in there, or I think, or most of them. I'm not sure if every single one is, and so I was curious about that movement, and like, at what point did you realize like, oh, that needs to happen? Like this all needs to be contained in, this is going to be this crossover moment. And I was wondering, did that come from sort of what needed to happen for the libretto, or was that more of a seeing the book as a book and realizing that needed to happen sort of for the arc of the book, or both, or neither?
All of the above. No, that's a great question. And it was, as you suggested, sort of dictated by the narrative dramatic needs of the libretto. It's like the second act crisis, the end of the second act. It's the end of the second movement. And so everybody's been kind of doing their own thing and like searching for each other or not, but kind of on their own. And there's approaching each other as that movement goes on. And then the crisis, we called it the Braid, as they all approached each other on the stage. And, that comes with a big revelation, which is that it's sort of like the we's are telling all of this, like it's just us telling all of this stuff. And the implications of that are kind of scary. So that's the crisis. And when it came time to put it on the page, that was the most challenging thing, the Braid. And in retrospect, it's pretty simple solution, just to kind of move everything together on the page in that way. But I don't know, I had to wrap my brain around it for a while to get that dramatic effect down on the page. Does that answer your question? Did I skip some part of that?
Yeah, totally. I love that idea of the braid. And I mean, we talk about braiding things in poems also, right? Mm-hmm. So this is like where these things overlap.
Yeah, the challenge was to make sure that the voices, that we can see that's what's happening, rather than just, so.
Right, because you don't have those actors on the stage who are showing it to us in that way. So you got to show it with the text itself.
Yeah,
which I think it does beautifully. Another moment which I think is really important and is about 3/4 of the way through the book, where we see almost the complete collapse of language and story. And it's kind of you talk about, there's some mention in the book of these dead zones. And that's like, I think of it as like a linguistic dead zone, like it becomes nearly unintelligible for just a brief amount of time. First, there are moments, there's sort of hints that that's coming, and then it really comes. And, as a poet putting a book together, that feels like to me like a risky thing to do, to include a moment like that. And I was wondering if you could talk about like why you felt like that needed to be there. And by the way, I hope it's clear from my question, I absolutely think it does need to be there, but I'm not upbraiding you for including it. So I'm curious just what how far did you, how did you know it needed to be there, and how did you know sort of how far to take it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a lot easier to do this on the stage, as you can imagine. And in a way, it makes it more scary to me. Like, it's a scary thing for me, probably obvious, as a writer, to have language just drop out like that. And it became scarier to see it on the page and to have to figure out what it looks like to have meaning just drop out and have there be these blanks and gibberish. And I had more of it originally. And I was just like, yeah, and you probably told me too. Gibson looked at a draft of this book earlier on, and you probably told me maybe we don't need so much of that. But Somebody did anyway. And it is, because it's a lot to take in. It's effort, and it's kind of traumatizing, I think, on some level, to have to look through all that and just, So there's just that one sort of climax of it. And then the we's start getting things, they turn it around, and we get language back and story back and the gods back.
And it absolutely feels necessary to me that we're sort of, I mean, it's a bit of a punch in the gut, but it's also like we're talking about the collapse of climate, like, so it feels like, an appropriate one to this reader.
And just like, so many of us feel so much grief and guilt, and it's overwhelming when we really stop and understand the enormity of what has gone on and what, that our species is implicated in. It's monstrous. So like, how do we deal with that? And the we's in the book deal with it by this kind of withdrawal, like withdrawing from the things that they think, that do mark them as human, like written language, like the gods, like story, as if everything that makes us human is somehow also implicated in everything we have done. So obviously that doesn't work so well for the we's, but it's kind of like taking to a logical, absurd end what that looks like when we just, when we take our guilt of what we've done so much to heart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was really, when I was reading the book again, there's a moment in the poem, "What Happened," that really caught me. The line in the poem, it says, "How do you grieve, we might ask, when there is every day more to grieve?" Mm-hmm. And it's a stunning question for the book and what this book is about. It also happens to be a stunning question for the moment that we're living in this year, which has been all about grief for so many folks. And we've been confronted with so many different crises kind of all at once. And does that strike you now, like with the book in your hand and this moment that we're living in?
Absolutely. I mean, I didn't really realize when I was writing it, but it is really a book about grief from almost beginning to end. And I had some personal reasons to think about that, like a couple of years ago, and be like, wow. And I read the poems again. I was like, wow, how did Demeter know that? Or how did Persephone know that? Because I didn't know it, and I needed to learn it, And so it's like wild. And now in this time, during the launch, I don't know if anyone was there, I teared up for sure when I read some of those ending poems about grief. And grief is something like, grief is another hole in the ground, and what do we do with the hole? And that's the question, right? What do we do with the hole? And Demeter says mysteries are the answer. And so, yeah, it's still amazing to me that it was like in there for me to write that somehow back when I had no reason to know,
Totally. Well, and I think it's one of those things where the poems are smarter than we are, and they sort of show us where to go sometimes and what.
Yeah, and that they don't really come, like, who knows where they come from. It's like, it really is wild. This book especially was just so wild in that way. Yeah.
Well, and this is like, I mean, talk about in terms of like overall project, this is obviously a connecting to and retelling this very, 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 very old story, right? Mm-hmm. Which is also obviously still has a lot to say to us right this second. Yeah, I mean, about the limits. I mean, that's what I see it as a story about, ultimately, is about limits, human limits, seasonal limits, but also human limits. Like, we have this time that we're going to be in the dark, kind of vicariously through Persephone. And when we start putting that out of balance is when, and we start thinking we can have it be light all the time and have all the things out of season that we want all the time, this is when things start to get kind of screwy. So about sort of reestablishing that balance in as much as we can, given the changes that have been made, I think. I also was thinking as I read the book, I was just thinking about this, what an amazing trajectory this book has had, to start with poems, and then it becomes a libretto and a contemporary opera and gets performed, and there's music and there's all these people who are involved, and then it goes back to this. I should hold it up. This beautiful book. So there's a few parts of this, but as you watch those performances by actors of this work, I wonder if there are certain things that you learned from that, like that became then part of the book in revision. Like, did they teach you certain things about the voices or the story that sort of helped then as you started to think about transforming it again into a book?
Right. I think it was more that I had those changes and influences in mind as I wrote, because it was like I wrote the first 4 poems and then they were performed, and then I wrote the first movement and we had a workshop production of just the first movement, and I wrote the second and third movement. So it kind of happened organically as I wrote the actual whole thing. And I think what I learned, I mean, I don't know if any of the actors are on the Zoom, but I sometimes felt so bad for the things I was making them memorize and say. So I think I learned a lot about, I mean, poetry is supposed to be a spoken art, and it is from way back. And I think this was a good wake-up call and reminder of that for me, like what I was making them put in their mouths, and how did it sound, and how simply could it come out and be projected and delivered while still conjuring imagery and complexity. And so I think there's a lot in this book that's very much more complicated than that, but that is not based on the words people held in their mouths. And I think that's the biggest thing that I took from as a lesson as a writer.
Yeah.
But what a gift to be able to and there's so many other things though that I wouldn't even be able to articulate now, about the inflection someone delivered a line with and how that contributed to my sense of the character. I could never, it's just so infused. It's like baked into this book, all of those influences of everyone involved in the project. Like so much community is involved in this project.
Yeah, totally. That's so apparent. And that is the second part of what I was thinking about with this project, which is, because you're somebody who has always written about theater, and you've done film, and you have lots of interests, although you are most certainly a poet. And so I wondered, does Megan long for more work like this, or like do you feel like, oh my gosh, can I just be alone in my room and write some poems for myself for a little while? Or I suspect there's a little bit of both, but I'm just like sort of where post now that the book is out, where you at with that?
Yeah, well, as you know from the launch, that was a real community effort as well, because there were all these multimedia aspects with actors and filmmakers, and the whole score was recorded, so musicians, and I was just dying for that, honestly, especially with all this. Like, I was just so thirsty for it, and it was wonderful to be able to be making a thing with other people, like a common purpose and other people's insights and creativity. And so I do want more of it. I really am. I'm thirsty to do more collaborative work. Yeah.
And there's I think it's fair to say, from what I know about you and your work, that there is like a real strong passion for other people's stories, right? Mm-hmm. As well as, obviously, you certainly are in there as well, but like, I'm thinking of Booker and other projects that you've done that really are in some ways documenting other stories.
Yeah, I have a couple projects like sort of out there that have been in the works for years, but not underway really. And one of them is another myth. It's Narcissus, which I think has some pretty interesting modern stuff I can play with. So that might be a performance thing or a film thing one of these days. But I do like taking an existing story and then like just kind of holding it up as a prism and seeing what else can we see, what else can we tell. Yeah.
That's cool. As I was again rereading, I was also struck by the the hopeful notes that get struck at the end of this book, in that last section in particular. Poems like To the Shine and Clamor and The Life of Her, where we really, it feels like Persephone is like the beating heart of the earth, and it's like, is she dead? No, actually, she's still alive, barely, but alive. So, do you want to maybe read a couple of those from that last section?
Yeah. So yeah, as Gibson says, this is from the last part of the book. After all the crazy and the gibberish and the falling away of everything, they turn it around. So The Life of Her. Back above, we were bruised and spent, and home was no different. The green crabs, the standing pools. At first, our eyes had trouble readjusting to the light. Every leaf, wing, and limb was sharper, stranger. She was sleeping, drowsing there near the cleft, her cheek pressed against the moss. We gathered, watched her sleep, grew breathless at the slightest tremor of her lips, at her freckles merging in the sun, at each bruise fading gently to yellow, at how she struck a faint tone, a little sharp, a smallest prick, each time she inhaled. She was alive, alive. We spoke the word over and over. The life of her, of every leaf, wing, and limb, rose in our chests, caught and wrung in our throats.
What was hardest about? It's a two-part question. What was the hardest part of? You mentioned earlier with the libretto, like that sort of realization of like, oh, I'm putting words in people in these actors' mouths, and like they better be good, like there's some more weight there because you're seeing that sort of in real time. So I'm wondering what was hardest about sort of some of the harder moments of writing the libretto and then getting it to performance, and then alternately, what was hardest about then the transformation of this material into book form?
Yeah, I think the hardest part was turning it around, like getting the wheeze to turn it around from the second act crisis, and then the third act is called descent. So it descends, and turning it around just conceptually was a real challenge for me. And that's what I was on residency at the time, and everybody was waiting for the second and third movements. And so I had to figure out what was going to happen, and how I knew it was going to come back, but how. And so that was really difficult. And once I got it, I was like, it felt like not that it would write itself after that, but it felt really good to know sort of what was the hinge to turn it back around.
And what was that like a craft and technical hinge that you needed to find, or was it like in part like a spiritual hinge, like not to, I mean, like this is like, it's heavy, this environmental crisis, it weighs on all of us, right? So
totally, yeah. I mean, I think just on a narrative level, like what was going to do it? What was, because there has to be, this is very plot driven, which poetry isn't necessarily, but it was very plot driven, which I struggle with plot. So like figuring out what are the plot points that hinge it, and the valence starts to become positive and all that. So yeah, and I think it was going back to the original myth that helped me finally get there. And I draw upon some more maybe like obscure aspects of the myth, but they really helped me because they're so weird and interesting and have so much truth in them. Like the hinge of this book, one of the two, has to do with this dirty old woman that's telling dirty jokes. And that's a real thing from the myth. Like I talk about it in the notes, but there was this old lady that like yelled out swear words as Demeter was wandering around grieving and looking for her kid. And that's what finally made her smile. And that's kind of what shifted the story for Demeter. And so it was cool to like, because laughter, right? Like even at the profane, even at the profanity of it all, it's such a timeless thing and so fun too. So I got to recycle a dirty joke, not dirty in the, like a, not dirty in the sexual sense, but a dirty joke that my dad used to tell me when I was a kid. And so I don't know if he recognizes it, but that's the joke in the book about the smart pills.
Yeah.
And it works because the smart pill, you know, like it just all came together. Smart pills and our big brains that have screwed everything up. And so everything just sort of fell into place once I looked backwards to the original myth. It was a pretty interesting process, actually.
Yeah, I love that you had to look backward to find that, you know. Yeah, and certainly, again, like we've probably all, you know, in this dark year, we've probably all had some moments like that where we needed a good dirty joke to just get through the day, you know.
Yeah, yeah, or like how popular watching the cold open is on SNL or Colbert or what, like, you know, that stuff serves a purpose.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
So that was the hardest part of the finding that for the libretto. What about for the process of transforming this into a book?
Yeah, I think like I said, just sort of figuring out how it was going to look on the page in order to try to preserve the movement. And I mean, I really struggled with that at first because it's like you're watching it and you get to see the character and hear the intonation of her voice and how do they move, who crosses whom, touch each other, like so much stuff is going on dynamically. And I would like look at it on the page and be like, is this gonna do anything on the page? You know, like are the words enough to show the distinct voices? How do I move things around so that there's a semblance of movement, physical movement? And I just had to move stuff around on my word processor a lot. And some of the harder ones, like I was saying before, the Braid, where all the three voices are coming closer and closer together before they become a singular voice, which they are for much of the third movement. And then like the hinge point with the dirty joke, like difficult to pull that off on the page too, I think, because just like, yeah, it's a lot to make happen on the page. And I'm still not sure I'm totally happy with how I did that.
Like any writer, you can't, it's never done, right?
Totally. Yep.
You're making notes in the margins as you read the poems, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Luckily, I'll probably never read that poem. I mean, that's the thing, is I'll probably never read a bunch of these poems at a reading, because how would I read that Braid unless I had people with me?
Right.
How would I read that poem with the dirty joke? Like, and there's different voices, and I'd have to go like this, or use a sock puppet. I could use a sock puppet.
2 sock puppets.
One on my feet, and my cat could walk in. If we're still on the Zoom, yeah.
I'm also curious about that. That the book leaves us that last poem with the funny looking gourd, and where did that come from? Is that something that came out of the myth, the deep roots of the myth, or is that did you just like happen upon a funny looking gourd?
No, the gourd is from the composer Dennis Nye was into Buddhism, and so he had told me about this koan. How do you get the goose out of the bottle? Some people might have heard this. You can't break the goose or the bottle, but you have to get the goose out of the bottle. And it's this whole thing. And I was always like, what? That doesn't make any sense. But I grew to like really sort of not really meditate on it, but think about it. And I sort of turned it into gourd, because that, in a way, the gourd being like our gourds, our funny looking gourds, and how do we get them out of the bottle without breaking the bottle or the gourd? So it became kind of another thing it's almost like koans are weird. They're like, they don't really have an answer, in the sense that there's an answer to that question. And I kind of like that too. It's very poetic. It's kind of like a joke and kind of like a riddle and kind of like but kind of not any of those things. And the gourd, comes up. It's kind of a motif through. And so I brought back the gourd again and tried to make something more more positive out of it.
I mean, as you said, it's a wonderful place for this book to end, because it doesn't, like, there's obviously these hopeful notes, but it doesn't like wrap everything up. Oh, good, glad that we solved that one, you know.
Right. Fix that.
Yeah. Would you mind reading that? You want to read one more
Oh,
poem?
sure. Funny Looking Gourd.
Yeah.
This is the very last poem in the book. So, and it's Demeter who's talking. So what happens is she is pulling a new narcissus from a hole. Its root is tough and its hole deep. Grief. You have heard that part. You have heard what kind of story this is. Not a whodunit. What happens is grief shrinks the stomach. But finally, grief is just one more hole in the ground. And what do you do with the hole? Mysteries? Yes, maybe. Yes, a mystery could grow out of the ground, out of a hole. Let's say they are, yes, a story. Yes, some part seed, some part fruit. Let's say they are a gourd, a funny looking gourd that you have grown from seed, then kept so long that you can make its own seeds rattle inside. Mysteries are meant to be saved, but also shaken. When you shake those seeds, you can make that gourd clamor. You can make that old gourd rattle something like a song.
Lovely. So you mentioned this a little bit, but I'm wondering what's next. What are you working on? What that you're willing to talk about? You know,
a writer's favorite question. No.
Yeah.
I've been working on this long form prose project, actually, that I just put together like a first full draft of. And it's super long and it needs to get cut a lot and it might not be any good. So that's where I'm at with that. I have to figure out if I keep working on it or not.
Right on.
But I also have, you know, some other projects that I would like to start. I have this project it's about what I call the fallingness, and has something to do with childhood and something to do with grief, I think. But it's like, I was thinking it might be fun to collaborate with an animator or a children's book illustrator and make it be kind of a children's book or children's animation for adults. Mm-hmm. So if anyone's listening and knows any animators, that would be really fun.
Right on. Yeah. What were there certain things that you were reading during this? Like, I'm thinking about just like, you know, there's like different kinds of source material. You know, obviously you had the myth itself and like various versions of it from over time. Assuming that was like a big part of the source material. This, mm-hmm. Then you've got, you know, stuff that's being written about the climate now and projecting into the future. Mm-hmm. Were there other things that you were like listening to or reading at the time of as this was putting it together? Obviously, it was over a long time, but anything you kind of like...
I must have been reading, right? It's funny. I have a hard time. Like, nothing is springing to mind as like the thing that was influential reading as I wrote it. If I sat and thought about it, I'm sure I'll come up with 10 things as soon as I get off the Zoom. But yeah, I don't know that anything is popping right up as an influential book that I was reading.
Yeah.
Right now.
I mean, the in terms of the story itself, I think it, like, the sort of direct influences are apparent in the book, you know, and in the notes and things that it's drawing on.
I feel like I was probably inspired by some kind of hybrid books that, you know, play with different, as you say, containers for the poem, but I just can't off the top of my head remember what they would be right now.
Right on. What about what things are getting you through right now? Like what are you reading now that's like, or what are you teaching now that's helping you and your students, you know? muddle through this time?
Let's see. Well, at the very beginning of the pandemic, I read the entire Elena Ferrante quartet in about a day and a half. No, I'm just kidding. A little longer than that, but it was like, finally, this is the perfect time. And I just devoured it. I recently read a book about eels. It was just a nonfiction book about eels and how mysterious they are, and how for a long time they thought that eels just like spontaneously generated out of the mud, because they couldn't find the reproductive organs of eels because they have all these life stages. And I learned, I'm telling everybody this because I think it explains a lot about the 20th century, but Freud, when he was like 19, traveled to Italy, and his job, like for months, all day long, he looked for testicles in eels and never found any. That's all I'm gonna say.
And psychoanalysis was built on that. That's great. I love it.
Yeah, it's pretty weird.
Yeah.
Life imitating art, or I don't know what that is exactly. Biology.
I know a lot of poets who do, but do you find yourself like reading a lot of nonfiction, like scientific texts, like things that are natural world stuff, or?
Sometimes. I actually feel like what I read most is fiction. At least over the pandemic, I've been reading a lot of fiction. I just started actually, it's nonfiction, but Eula Biss's new book on having and being had. So kind of about capitalism and ownership, and sort of a long form lyric essay kind of thing on that, which is something I think about a lot. Ownership and capitalism, and what does it mean for me personally? What does it mean for us as a culture? And so she takes it from a very personal perspective. And like she had a very bohemian background as a young person, and she buys a house, and then it's like, wow, I own this house. Now what? What is that all about? So I think it's an interesting thing to ponder for us all.
Yeah, I've heard great things about that book. I've heard her talk about it a little bit. Yeah, it sounds fascinating. Yeah, I think Rachel's might be about to join us here.
I did. I popped back in. We just have a couple questions, but I just wanted to say thank you both before we do that. That was a great conversation, and so nice to hear you read your work, Megan.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's so great to be here and to get to talk about it. It's such a privilege. Thank you to you and to the library and to Gibson and to everybody for coming.
Thank you. So we got a question from Erin. She said, would love to hear Megan talk about books, which you just have, and specifically poems or other work she's loved lately. What and why? I know you were talking a little bit about the books you're reading, but maybe specifically other poets.
Poets that I have read lately. Let's see, like new poets?
Any poets.
Any poets. All right. I was just answering some interview questions for the Cloudy House, and they were asking me about project books, which this is a project book, obviously, and they were asking me about other project books that I've loved. And one of those that I wrote in my answers was Tahimba Jess's Olio, about minstrelsy in America. Oh, that's one that I should say that was influential, about the different containers of forms, Gibson, because I don't know if anybody's read it, but it's a big, large book, and he does all kinds of formally innovative things. Oh yes, it's so good. Like these syncopated sonnets, which it's like two sonnets next to each other that you can read like each by itself or across or down, and they all work. And not just that they all work, but they're all beautifully written. So I was just so impressed by his different containers and how he approached this very complicated subject and very fraught subject through such a prismatic approach. Like, I love that. I love when writers do that. Another project book I answered was C.D. Wright's One with Others, which is about, she had this mentor named Vi in Arkansas that was a civil rights activist, and this really feisty white lady that got run out of town eventually. But and she passed away. And so C.D. Wright kind of went back to the town and remembered things and listened to transcripts and found advertisements from the time and all kinds of stuff. And it's again, like a very prismatic sort of oral history approach to this portrait of this woman who was so influential to her. An old friend of mine, Ara Ross, wrote a book about, it's called Seedlip and Sweet Apple, and it's about Mother Ann Lee. She actually came, years ago, she came here to Maine to research at the Shaker Village in Gray New Gloucester, and sort of the origins and, again, a portrait of Mother Ann Lee and sort of her time, and using inventories and lyric poems and just all kinds of, again, like a really beautiful prismatic approach to this very complex person. So those are a few that I love.
That's great. And Becca linked a few of those titles in the chat for people that want to look them up and perhaps borrow them or buy them. This one came early on in the conversation, so it's sort of referencing an earlier questioning line, but this is from Les. Aren't mysteries the stuff in the crucible that spawns the future, possibly a better one? And then he follows that up by saying, scientifically, we call this deterministic chaos.
Whoa.
Yeah, I know. I'm glad I don't have to answer that, but.
Is that a question? Maybe that's a comment. Wow, deterministic chaos. I don't know how to respond to that.
Well, maybe we can leave it as a thought as well.
I love it. I'm going to look that up, though.
Yeah. I think that's all we had in the chat, Zoom. So, I mean, there's a couple more minutes if people want to chat, but I will just say, Megan, also, I meant to say in the beginning, your website is so full and updated of your work. It's a huge resource, I think. So if anyone's interested in finding out more about what you're doing, there's a lot there, and some of the videos from this book and other projects are on there as well. It looks like.
Yeah, and I should also say that if anyone's interested in hearing the score that accompanied the original opera, we recorded it this summer safely with masks and isolation booths at Acadia Recording Company, and so that's all. I don't think I've linked to it yet on my website, but I'll put something up there. You can find it at Bandcamp. If you Google Dennis Nye and Bandcamp, it's all on there, all three movements, no words. So you don't have to be distracted by the words. You can just enjoy the music.
That's great. I think we will link that right underneath this video on our website. So
great. That'd be lovely.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear that.
And I should also plug, I don't know if this will be ever open to the public at this juncture, but there's an exhibit that I'm co-curating with Jenna Crowder, opening, I think, at the end of the week or maybe early next week at the University of New England's Ketchum Gallery. So it's the library gallery, if anyone's familiar with campus, lots of glass. And so it's kind of a response and conversation with this text. There'll be a couple poems on the walls, printed and mounted, and there are also new paintings by Patrick Corrigan, who responded to the text, and Hannah Secord Wade, who lives up near Bath. We'll also have some of the scores printed and mounted, so it's kind of like another polyphonic approach to this climate crisis question, and how do we respond to it? What are different ways of telling our way through it, and hopefully beyond it? So if anyone, there will be a virtual tour that people will be able to experience, since right now the campus is not open to the public, unfortunately. But if it does open, if everything gets back to normal by May, then maybe we can be there together on the campus. But anyway, you can check that out at the UNE website.
That's super exciting. And I'm so glad that you said next week rather than 3 months from now, because I can't wait to check that out. So I think we'll put a link to that virtual tour when we get one on our website too. So in the meantime, it doesn't look like any other questions have come back, but thank you both again so much. That was a great conversation and lovely to start our year out with poetry, and we'll see everyone really soon, virtually at least.
Thank you so much. Really lovely to be with you all, and great questions, Gibson, as always. Lovely conversation. So I'm wishing everybody well and stay safe and stay happy.